You stand beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Roman imperial palace, where the scent of myrrh and jasmine cannot mask the odor of fear. The marble beneath your bare feet feels colder than stone should, like the floor of a tomb. Torchlight dances across gilded walls, illuminating statues of goddesses whose serene faces mock you with their silence. Outside the chamber, eunuchs whisper in a language of obedience, their soft sandals sliding over the mosaic floors as they prepare the room for ritual. The silk robe they've draped over you feels less like a garment and more like a burial shroud. Somewhere beyond those golden doors waits the emperor, the living god of Rome, whose glance could condemn armies or summon storms. You've heard the rumors. Some girls return pale and trembling, others are never seen again. The door closes behind you with a sound that feels final, like a verdict being sealed. You realize now that this is not seduction. It is ceremony. You are not a woman tonight. You are an offering, one body among thousands, fed to the empire's insatiable cult of power. But to understand why that first night felt like an execution disguised as devotion, we must descend into the machinery of Rome's hidden pleasure bureaucracy. If this glimpse into Rome's forbidden corridors grips you, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. It fuels more excavations like this, where truth is exhumed from the ruins of empire. Because Rome, for all its marble glory and disciplined legions, was not just a civilization. It was a system of control so vast it reached even into the private chambers of its rulers. Spanning 3 continents and 60 million souls, the empire prided itself on order. But behind that order lay something colder, a bureaucracy that turned human intimacy into a ledger entry. Concubinage in Rome was not chaos, it was policy. Chroniclers, tablets, and carved inscriptions prove it was calculated, structured for efficiency, cloaked in divinity, and sustained by fear. This is not legend. It is administration made flesh. This is not passion. It's bureaucracy carved in marble. The nightmare did not begin inside the palace. It began in the provinces, in the quiet homes of people who still believed Rome was a distant rumor, not a presence that could reach through their doors. Every year, imperial envoys rode into the conquered lands of Gaul, Syria, Egypt, and Thrace with scrolls sealed in crimson wax orders from the capital demanding tribute of beauty. Governors called it an honor. The people called it what it was, a harvest of daughters. The census men arrived with measuring rods and scribes, evaluating not fields or livestock this time, but human beings. Height, skin tone, symmetry of face all entered into ledgers beside grain tallies and tax quotas. The act was systematic, efficient, bureaucratic. Rome never conquered by sword alone, it conquered by lists. Families learned to hide their girls as they would treasure, staining their faces with ash, cutting their hair short to make them look unworthy. But the empire's network was meticulous. Soldiers, physicians, and slaves collaborated in this quiet economy of flesh. When found, the chosen were paraded not in chains, but in silks, as though luxury itself were a shackle. To refuse was treason, and to comply was despair. Mothers stood in doorways watching their children taken away in wagons bound for the coast, where imperial ships waited with the same patience as merchants counting grain. Some tried to buy back their daughters, but the price of purity was higher than gold. It was power, and power had only one buyer. The voyages to Rome were slow and deliberate, designed less for comfort than control. The young women were fed sparingly, bathed rarely, and spoken to only through commands. Eunuch overseers, castrated not merely to serve, but to embody the empire's absolute authority over the body, kept detailed records of behavior, illness, and moral pliancy. These scrolls, some still deciphered in the ruins of Ostia, read like inventories of objects, not people. One lists 50 from Alexandria, 20 from Cappadocia, all unblemished, teeth intact, compliant temperament. The term temperament appeared again and again, a euphemism that meant they would not fight, would not scream, would not weep where it could be heard. Upon arrival, the girls were not taken to the emperor. They were processed. The imperial compound at Palatine Hill contained chambers known as Domus Disciplinae, houses of discipline. There, they were washed in perfumed oils, trained in etiquette, and stripped of everything that tethered them to their past, their names, their languages, their gods. Each new identity was chosen by scribes who drew from lists of goddesses, Flora, Venus, Cybele, so that the emperor might never speak a real name. In the ledgers of the palace, a girl ceased to exist as a daughter and began to exist as an asset. The teachers of these women were not other women, but eunuchs, living reminders of what disobedience cost. They taught how to walk slowly enough to appear humble, how to lower the eyes to suggest devotion, how to breathe without trembling when the imperial gaze fell upon them. Every movement rehearsed, every breath counted. And when one failed to meet the standard, too slow, too fearful, too alive, she was quietly reassigned, some to kitchens, some to distant temples, some simply vanished. No record, no grave, just an erasure. The system was perfect because it needed no cruelty to sustain itself. Fear did the work. The ceremony of the first night was a study in orchestrated terror. Before the emperor ever entered, the concubine underwent a sequence of rituals that mimicked holiness. She was anointed with oils from Arabia, dressed in transparent linen threaded with gold, and paraded through torchlit corridors to the accompaniment of flutes. The purpose was not beauty, it was submission. Chroniclers later wrote that the emperor's chamber smelled not of desire, but of incense thick enough to choke. Behind curtains embroidered with laurels, witnesses waited, eunuchs, physicians, sometimes priests. Their duty was to observe, to ensure that the act fulfilled divine and legal expectations. Every motion was reported, every silence noted. If she fainted, it was recorded as weakness of spirit. If she screamed, disruption of the rite. This was not passion, it was data collection. Physicians would later examine her, not for injury, but for proof of acceptance, a grotesque term meaning the absence of resistance. Their notes joined the growing mountain of imperial paperwork, transforming a night of terror into a bureaucratic success. Those who survived this initiation were marked, not with scars, but with privileges designed to bind them tighter. Fine food, jewels, soft rooms, rewards that ensured obedience. For the empire had learned the most efficient form of slavery was comfort. Give enough silk, and the prisoner might forget the iron. Yet among the concubines, rumors persisted, of those who failed to please and were sent away to monasteries or mines, their beauty deemed disruptive to order. One surviving papyrus from the archives of Domitian's reign lists expenditures for transportation of the unsuitable. Nothing else. No names, no destinations. The emperor himself was often absent from these horrors. His role was symbolic, the apex of a pyramid built from countless lesser cruelties. Officials, servants, guards, record-keepers all participated. The system was self-sustaining because it offered every man below him a reflection of the same power. To own, to command, to silence. In time, the empire even exported this model. Provincial governors began keeping their own harems, smaller mirrors of the imperial institution. The term concubina publica appears in legal tablets from North Africa and Hispania, state-recognized mistresses whose existence paid tribute to the emperor's divine right. It is here that the horror deepens. The system was not hidden, it was celebrated. Poets praised the emperor's gardens of devotion. Sculptors carved marble nudes modeled on the enslaved women themselves, immortalizing their subjugation as art. To the public, they were symbols of fertility and empire. To the women, reminders that even their likenesses were not their own. Some families sent their daughters willingly, seduced by the promise of favor or citizenship. These girls, too, became prisoners, though gilded ones. The empire was masterful at turning complicity into policy. A willing sacrifice was cheaper than a rebellion, and through it all, Rome documented everything. Every shipment, every body, every child born or discarded. Archaeologists in the 20th century uncovered fragments of bronze tablets cataloging the births within palace walls. Children recorded not by mother's name but by imperial designation, but human lineage reduced to a statistical trace. Again and again the same words appear, systematic, measured, approved. The language of order masking the machinery of horror. By the time the concubines completed their training, they no longer remembered what ordinary silence sounded like. Every corridor in the palace had its own rhythm, the echo of footsteps, the murmur of fountains, the occasional cry muffled by marble. But inside the cubiculum, Where the emperor's private attendants slept, silence was law. Every whisper was punishable. Every gesture carried the weight of interpretation. The empire didn't just own their bodies, it owned their breath. This was Rome's genius, the ability to turn violence into routine, to make the unimaginable feel inevitable. What began as conquest evolved into culture. Every emperor, from Augustus to Commodus, inherited not only a throne but a system, a living machine of obedience, polished by generations who had forgotten it was built on human lives. And for those within its walls, the cruelty was most terrifying because it was predictable. When a concubine was chosen for the night, her summons came written on a strip of vellum, delivered by an attendant who avoided her eyes. The message contained no words, only a seal, an eagle, wings spread in triumph. That emblem meant elevation or extinction. She would not know which until dawn. Inside the chamber, the emperor's attendants oversaw the ritual, ensuring the bedding was pristine, the lamps arranged in perfect symmetry, the atmosphere suitable for divine communion. Every detail had meaning. Even the temperature of the room was recorded in certain reigns, as though comfort could excuse corruption. The first night was a sacred fiction, a performance of dominance staged as religious offering. Priests blessed the threshold, invoking Venus and Juno, as though the violation to come required divine witness. The eunuchs would withdraw, their absence more haunting than their presence. What happened next was private only in name. It would be remembered, reported, and judged. The emperor's satisfaction became state record. The concubine's endurance became her only currency. If she survived the night without protest or injury, she was considered initiata, initiated into the order of imperial concubines. Those who failed, who cried out, resisted, or simply could not please, disappeared by morning. The marble halls of Domus Augustana were vast, and no one questioned when a room fell empty. Archaeologists centuries later uncovered small niches carved into the lower palace levels, each the size of a single human body. The walls were scorched with soot, suggesting torchlight, perhaps confinement. Some historians dismissed them as storage spaces. Others whispered they were holding cells, used during the testing period. The empire had no reason to hide such practices. To Rome, cruelty was not shameful, it was administrative necessity. The survivors lived within invisible hierarchies. Some became favorites, gifted villas, perfumes, and influence in imperial decisions. Others faded into anonymity, their days measured by the emperor's appetite. One chronicler from the court of Tiberius recorded that the emperor's staff rotated women through his chambers by schedule, marking their use in the same ledgers as livestock feed. These documents, written in the cold hand of bureaucracy, describe a civilization that viewed emotion as inefficiency. Rome's obsession with order extended even to reproduction. Pregnancy within the palace was strictly regulated. Imperial physicians tracked menstrual cycles, estimating fertility windows with remarkable precision for the era. Some women were given potions to prevent conception, others forced to bear children who would never bear their father's name. The empire called it dynastic purity. Modern readers would call it eugenics. Those who conceived imperial offspring were confined to guarded quarters until childbirth. Many died in secrecy. The infants, if male, were sometimes claimed as wards of the state. If female, they joined the ranks of the palace-born concubines, raised for the same fate. The system fed itself, a perpetual cycle of possession. Rome's historians rarely wrote about these women except in mockery. Tacitus called them ornaments of indulgence. Suetonius, more cruelly, catalogued them as proofs of divine favor. To them, the suffering was background noise in a symphony of conquest. Even moralists like Seneca, who preached restraint, described the emperor's pleasures as an unfortunate but natural extension of power. No one questioned the foundation of the system, because the empire's order depended on the illusion that every cruelty had purpose. And yet, the machinery faltered. Rumors spread of concubines who rebelled, not through violence, but silence. Refusing to speak, refusing to eat, refusing to respond to the emperor's touch. The eunuchs reported these acts as defective submission, but privately, some recorded admiration. A fragmentary inscription found near Palatine Hill reads simply, "She would not bow." The name beneath it is gone, scratched away by time or decree. Economically, the concubine system became a quiet industry. Provinces competed to send the most beautiful captives, knowing imperial favor could mean reduced taxes. Merchants trafficked in perfumes, fabrics, and cosmetics explicitly labeled for palace use. The empire's sexual economy rippled across borders. Even artisans profited crafting jewelry designed to be worn once and discarded, as if beauty itself were disposable. This was psychological warfare disguised as luxury. The empire rewarded its victims with comfort, knowing that comfort binds more tightly than chains. A concubine dressed in gold was less likely to dream of escape. Her identity eroded slowly, replaced by ritual obedience and the illusion of privilege. The eunuchs called this transformation domita animae, the tamed soul. To sustain the illusion of sanctity, the emperors wrapped their desires in religion. Statues of Venus adorned the halls where women wept in silence. Altars were built within the women's quarters, where daily prayers were offered not to gods of love, but to gods of empire. Every act of submission was reframed as devotion. They were told they served not the man, but Rome itself. In that lie, the empire found immortality. The numbers, when reconstructed, are staggering. Historians estimate that over the centuries, tens of thousands of women passed through imperial palaces. Some lived for decades, others only days. Mortality was rarely recorded. In ledgers that survive, death is marked by a single line, subducta, removed. The word appears beside spoiled grain and broken amphorae. And still, the people outside the walls dreamed of proximity to power. Parents bribed officials for their daughters to be considered, mistaking slavery for opportunity. Courtiers whispered that to be chosen by the emperor was divine favor, a chance for one's bloodline to ascend. Thus, the empire's cruelty endured not through fear alone, but through aspiration. Occasionally, a concubine would bear influence, like Claudia Act, mistress to Nero, who allegedly tempered his rage in youth. But even she was expendable. When favors shifted, she vanished from records, her name surviving only in fragments. Power in Rome was borrowed, only the machine was eternal. By the late imperial period, the system became industrial in scope. Specialized scouts traveled from province to province, mapping villages by beauty yield. Roman coins from that era depict women's profiles with exaggerated features, suggesting even art was influenced by the trade. Rome no longer saw women as subjects of love or worship, but as raw material for empire's appetite. Pause and imagine it. An entire civilization that built roads, aqueducts, and laws, and used that same genius to refine the enslavement of intimacy. They engineered cruelty the way they engineered architecture, measured, symmetrical, enduring. The concubine's first night was never meant to end. It repeated endlessly, in every generation, each act justified by ritual, each silence preserved by marble. The empire's true legacy was not its legions or laws. It was the normalization of possession. Those who lived through it carried the empire inside them long after Rome itself had fallen. Some escaped to remote villas, some joined early Christian communities seeking purity, and some were buried without names beneath the very palaces that consumed them. When archaeologists unearthed their remains centuries later, they found traces of gold thread woven into bone dust, evidence of garments never meant to be worn by the free. Rome's greatness, carved into monuments and echoed in textbooks, was built on foundations that screamed silently. The emperors changed, the gods changed, but the system remained. The belief that the body could be owned, that obedience could be sanctified, that terror could be ritualized until it became divine order. If this chills you as it does me, subscribe. Because the past is not gone, it waits, buried in marble and ash, whispering reminders of what power becomes when it learns to love its own cruelty. The deeper you peer into Rome's machinery of desire, the more it reveals itself, not as lust, but as logic. Every cruelty had its clerk, every nightmare its note-taker. The empire's genius was its ability to disguise barbarity behind scrolls, signatures, and divine decrees. The palace's heart did not beat with passion, it ticked like a ledger. By the 2nd century, the system had matured into what scholars now call the Domus Perpetua, or perpetual household. a machine of pleasure and punishment that ran without pause, powered by paperwork and fear. Each emperor inherited not a harem but an institution, regulated by law, funded by the treasury, and sanctified by priests who called it pietas imperialis, the duty of divinity. The emperor's body was state property, they said. His pleasures therefore served the gods. To deny them would be heresy, and thus sin became ritual, and ritual became administration. Scrolls from Hadrian's reign list, requisitions for seasonal replenishment of palace attendants, language identical to the reports used for grain supply. Women were logistics. They were shipped, stored, and replaced in cycles that aligned with festivals, military triumphs, and royal anniversaries. In one chilling record from 132 CE, an imperial quartermaster notes that 27 items of delicate constitution perished in transport from Cyrene, adding, without emotion, that replacements were expected before solstice. The dead were paperwork, not people. The eunuchs, the keepers of order, had become high priests of this silent religion. They were not merely servants, they were overseers, engineers of compliance. Their castration was not just mutilation, it was metamorphosis. The empire demanded their loyalty, purified by the removal of desire. They embodied Rome's vision of perfection, a being of authority without humanity. And beneath them, thousands obeyed. Scribes, guards, chamberlains, all cogs turning without thought, sustaining a cruelty so efficient it no longer required cruelty at all. Inside the palace, concubines aged like prisoners watching the seasons change through barred windows. Once chosen, few ever left. The walls of the cubiculum became their horizon, the emperor's moods, their weather. They learned to predict survival by the smallest signs, by the tone of his footsteps, by the number of guards at the door. Some prayed to the household gods, others to forgotten deities from their homelands. None prayed for love anymore. There are fragments from Roman satire mocking these women as silent statues. Yet beneath the mockery lies fear, because even the poets knew that what lived in those chambers was not erotic, but apocalyptic. They wrote of rooms where no laughter was allowed, where the emperor's breath dictated life and death, where a single touch could elevate or erase. The palace was not a home, it was a living graveyard for the forgotten. Outside those walls, the empire prospered. Roads gleamed, fountains sparkled, and senators toasted to the glory of Rome. Citizens walked past marble monuments depicting Venus crowned by victory, never realizing that those statues were modeled on the enslaved women within. Public virtue was built upon private violation. The Senate's decrees spoke of morality and order, even as the emperor's chambers institutionalized despair. The dissonance was not hypocrisy. It was philosophy. To the Romans, power and piety were twins, each justified by the other. And still, the cycle deepened. As emperors changed, the system endured, adapting with precision. Under Commodus, concubines were graded by utility and temperament, categories borrowed from livestock markets. Under Septimius Severus, the palace maintained genealogical scrolls to trace bloodlines, ensuring no woman of inferior descent could bear imperial offspring. And under Diocletian, the process became almost scientific. He ordered the first official census of female attendants within divine residences, complete with mortality rates and fertility yields. It was no longer a hidden crime, it was policy. The empire had become what it always desired to be, eternal, a god machine that consumed lives to maintain the illusion of perfection. And inside it, the concubines, once flesh and blood, had become symbols of submission so absolute that even rebellion lost meaning. One chronicler during Constantine's early reign dared to question the institution. His notes, preserved in fragment, read, "We built temples to virtue while feasting on innocence. We sanctified ownership and called it order, and the cries we did not hear will be the echo that outlives us all." He was never heard from again. Rome was entering its final centuries, but its system would not die with its emperors. The pleasure bureaucracy had already infected every level of the empire, from generals who demanded captives as spoils to governors who built their own miniature palaces of silence. Even the distant provinces learned the ritual, the inspection, the selection, the first night. It was replication by design horror masquerading as civilization. Pause here. Imagine the scale. Tens of thousands of women across continents, their pain synchronized by empire. The same songs, the same baths, the same rituals, repeated in marble chambers from Hispania to Antioch. A single will, Rome's will reaching into every private breath of its dominions. That is where the true horror lay. Not in the act itself, but in its normalization. There came a time when even Rome began to choke on its own perfection. The machine it had built to regulate pleasure and power grew so vast that it could no longer tell the difference between them. The same pen that signed edicts of conquest also scheduled who would be summoned to the imperial bed. Every corner of the empire was touched by the system, and yet no one could point to where it truly began. It was everywhere and nowhere, like a god that fed on silence. In the later centuries, the institution reached its logical conclusion. The palace became an organism that devoured itself. Records from the reign of Elagabalus speak of contests where concubines were forced to entertain senators, their performances judged not by grace, but by how convincingly they simulated joy. Joy became currency, traded for survival. And the eunuchs, those quiet administrators of pain, became arbiters of taste, their signatures deciding who lived, who aged in luxury, and who vanished. But the empire's cruelty did not only break bodies, it rewired minds. The women who endured longest often became trainers of the next generation, teaching the gestures of surrender as if they were prayers. Keep your eyes down, smile when you are afraid, never show hunger, never show hate. These were not lessons of love, they were survival manuals. The machine had achieved its masterpiece, victims who maintained the system themselves. Each emperor inherited a darker version of what his predecessors perfected. Claudius institutionalized service rotation, ensuring no concubine could hold his attention long enough to influence policy. Nero staged mock weddings to his favorites, parading them before the Senate to mock the very idea of purity. Domitian's reign recorded the first performance audits, eunuchs evaluating behavior as if the women were soldiers. The palace had become a military of flesh, commanded by fear. Every so often, a story pierced the silence, a whispered legend of a woman who defied the emperor, who chose death over submission. Chroniclers mention one such figure during Marcus Aurelius's reign, a slave from Cappadocia named Irene. When summoned, she refused to bathe in the sacred oils, claiming her body belonged to her gods. For that defiance, she was executed quietly, her name erased from records. Yet among servants and slaves, her story endured as a forbidden prayer. Irene did not bow. The empire's priests could destroy her body, but not her myth. Still, most could not resist. The penalties were too absolute, the fear too intimate. The emperor's will reached every mind before his hand ever touched skin. In time, concubines began to measure life not in years, but in nights survived. They stopped asking when they might be freed, and began asking only that they might be forgotten, because in Rome, remembrance was punishment. To be remembered was to be consumed again. And outside those palace walls, the infection spread through generations. Senators who had seen the emperor's system recreated it in miniature, keeping private attendants as marks of prestige. Governors in the provinces built imitation chambers with imported marble and incense from the capital. The horror became culture. The ritual became inheritance. Citizens, once horrified, now saw it as Rome's right proof that civilization itself required the ownership of others. It is here, in the empire's twilight, that the moral decay becomes undeniable. The same empire that built aqueducts to nourish millions could starve a girl to preserve her figure. The same rulers who wrote laws of justice in bronze could erase a name from stone without a trace of guilt. Every triumphal arch, every column, every marble god was mirrored by a hidden grave below it. Rome's greatness was balanced on a ledger of ghosts, and yet those ledgers still exist, buried in libraries and ruins, unearthed in fragments of papyrus blackened by time. They list figures, ages, nationalities, costs. No emotion, no remorse. But between the lines lies something far more human, the shadow of a scream that bureaucrats tried to erase with ink. When archaeologists in the modern era found one such ledger beneath the Palatine, they discovered an entry that simply read, 15 new arrivals, to be broken in accordance with tradition. 2. No details, no mercy, just an order followed by a seal. The wax was still faintly red. Pause for a moment. Imagine the precision it takes to record suffering so neatly. Imagine the generations who signed their names beneath such words, believing they served civilization. That is the most chilling truth of Rome. It did not love cruelty for chaos. It worshipped cruelty for control. And when the empire finally began to crumble, when its borders shrank and its gods fell silent, the machine did not vanish. It adapted. The palaces were looted, the eunuchs slain, but the ideology survived. The Byzantines, the caliphs, the sultans, all inherited fragments of that Roman formula, the sanctification of possession, the weaponization of beauty. Rome had taught the world that domination could masquerade as divinity. By the 5th century, the concubines of the Western Empire were ghosts, living in half-empty palaces, serving emperors who ruled only in name. Their silence outlasted Rome itself. When the Visigoths sacked the city in 410 CE, they found women still waiting in those golden rooms, unsure whether they were captives or free. They clutched the keys to chambers that no longer mattered, wearing jewels paid for by the same system that destroyed them. History recorded the fall of Rome as a military event. In truth, it had already died long before, of spiritual rot, born in the bedchambers of emperors who mistook worship for ownership. Rome collapsed, but the pattern it perfected did not. Every empire that followed, Byzantium, Ottoman, Mughal, echoed its system of intimate domination. And the phrase that once echoed in Latin corridors, chosen for the night, would reappear in new languages, under new gods, carrying the same meaning, power's oldest ritual, dressed in new robes. The empire's ruins stand silent today, but if you walk those marble halls at dusk, you can still feel it. The ghost of the bureaucracy that turned love into policy and women into statistics. Every column casts a shadow shaped like the ones who were never allowed to stand upright. And if you listen long enough, the silence itself begins to sound like their breath. When the last torches of Rome guttered out, the empire did not die. It merely shifted shape. Its walls crumbled, but its ideas endured, etched into the marrow of civilizations that rose in its shadow. The bureaucracies of pleasure it created left no statues, no tombs, only a lingering instinct that power has the right to possess, and that silence is the cost of survival. The marble cracked, the emperors turned to dust, yet the echo of those first nights still trembles through time. Today, archaeologists sift through the debris of palaces that once shimmered with opulence, finding bones laced with fragments of gold, the faint imprint of silk on stone floors, and ledgers so precise they could belong to a modern accountant. Numbers where there should have been names, transactions where there should have been tenderness. These artifacts are not relics of love. They are fossils of control, preserved in the sediment of empire. Historians speak of Rome's achievements, its aqueducts, its laws, its architecture, but rarely of the hidden cost that paid for them. Behind every victory arch lay another arch, invisible to the eye, built from suffering. Behind every emperor's triumphal procession marched a shadow army of the broken and unnamed. They were the scaffolding upon which civilization stood, forgotten the moment the parade ended. And yet, they endure, not in statues or chronicles, but in the silent gaps of history. The missing names, the erased inscriptions, the redacted scrolls, their stories live in absence. Every time we walk through the ruins of the Palatine or gaze upon marble that once witnessed their fear, we participate in remembrance. The empire wanted obedience. What it achieved instead was haunting. Civilization, at its peak, often confuses refinement with righteousness. Rome believed it was the light of the world even as it consumed its own humanity in the pursuit of perfection. That paradox endures wherever authority disguises cruelty as order, wherever intimacy becomes transaction, wherever bureaucracy outlives compassion. The empire's ghosts still walk among us, in boardrooms, in regimes, in systems that count lives but not souls. The women who dreaded their first night with the emperor did not die entirely. Their fear became warning, their silence became testimony. Their endurance became history's conscience. If this history stirred you to reflection, subscribe and share where it hit hardest in the comments below. Because remembering them is not just storytelling, it's resistance. Every truth we exhume from the ruins weakens the empires still waiting to be built upon the same silence. The marble may have turned to dust, but the breath of the forgotten still moves through the cracks, reminding us that every throne is temporary and every cruelty leaves an echo.